Welcome to the Deep Dive, the shortcut you need to understand the frontiers of technology and policy. Today, we are strapping in for a discussion that, well, it fundamentally redefines what it means to be a thinking human being. We're diving into the dramatic collision of neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and global policy, all fueled by the rapid advance of brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs. The technological leap that has really thrust this topic from, the academic fringes into the global news cycle is, of course, the progress made by Elon Musk's Neuralink. Their announcement back in January 2024 of the first surgical implant in a human being was, well, a stunning technical feat. The goal to allow people to control digital devices simply by thinking. Now, while the immediate focus is on restoring function for the paralyzed, the ultimate implications, they really open up a Pandora's box of ethical, legal, and truly existential questions.
That's absolutely the core tension we need to explore today. The technology is just accelerating so rapidly that governments, policymakers, they're scrambling to play catch-up. For you, the listener, our mission is to analyze, three key areas of friction. First, we need to gauge the public's true readiness for this technology. Where do they draw the line between fixing a problem and, well, upgrading the species? Second, we'll look at the fundamental difference between brain data and really every other type of personal data we've ever tried to protect. We need to define why scholars call it the final frontier of privacy.
Right, the final frontier.
Exactly. And third, we'll explore the unprecedented global policy response, specifically the rise of neurorights that aim to safeguard our minds. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we'll see this discussion inevitably leads to the ultimate philosophical challenge, digital immortality.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with the people who will actually be using or maybe rejecting this technology. So when you look at the raw numbers, say, from that 2021 Pew survey of U.S. adults, the public response to BCIs for general enhancement is, well, it's overwhelmingly skeptical. It's not just like polite caution. It seems like a strong rejection of the idea that this tech should become widespread just for upgrading cognitive function.
Yeah, the skepticism is incredibly revealing. A clear majority of U.S. adults, what was it, 56%? They viewed the widespread use of brain chips for cognitive enhancement as a bad idea for society. And conversely, only 13% saw it as a good idea.
Yeah.
So this isn't really a divided issue. It's a heavily weighted skepticism towards human upgrades.
And personally.
Well, when you ask people about applying this technology personally, the reluctance hardens even further. A huge majority, 78%, said they would not want a chip implant for themselves. Only 20% expressed any interest at all.
Wow, 78%. That's not just a statistical blip. It really suggests a deep-seated philosophical resistance, doesn't it? The survey actually captured this explicitly. 63% felt that widespread use of brain chips was, and this is their words, meddling with nature and crosses a line we should not cross. That's not a technical judgment about, battery life. This feels like a moral boundary.
It absolutely is a moral boundary, and it's one that's profoundly influenced by people's underlying belief systems. The data shows this massive split based on religious commitment. Among highly religious Americans, 81% view the technology as crossing that line.
81%, yeah.
Yeah. That perception dropped significantly, though. It still remains the majority, down to 50% among those with low religious commitment. So this really demonstrates that for many, the debate over BCIs is fundamentally spiritual. It touches on, the definition of God's plan, or maybe the inherent perfection or imperfection of the human form.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, I think, because that deep-seated philosophical skepticism, it seems to flip completely when you shift the context, when you move away from enhancement to therapy. It really looks like the public draws a very sharp line between using technology to restore a person and using it to upgrade a person.
Oh, the contrast is dramatic.
Yeah.
It totally highlights the humanitarian appeal of the technology. While most Americans rejected the chip for personal or societal enhancement, 77% favored using chips to allow increased movement for people who are paralyzed. That's a huge number.
77%, okay.
And furthermore, 64% favor them specifically for treating age-related mental decline, things like Alzheimer's or severe dementia. The public clearly sees immense value in recovering lost functionality. It makes perfect sense.
So the tech is largely viewed as a tool of compassion, almost. But the moment you start talking about optimizing the human condition, support just plummets. We see this specifically when the function moves toward pure enhancement, right? Only 32% favored chips used to directly translate thoughts into text, which, let's be honest, is a major goal for many BCI companies.
Absolutely.
And only 25% supported using them to search the internet just by thinking. So it seems like the restore autonomy part of the BCI mission is embraced, but the whole unlock human potential part that's viewed with deep suspicion.
And this distinction is absolutely crucial for regulatory bodies to understand.
Oh,
The
yeah.
public accepts the utility of the chip as a medical device for disability, but rejects it as, say, a consumer device for competitive advantage. And this caution extends directly to issues of vetting and safety, too. They aren't just worried about philosophical boundaries, they're worried about the device itself. A staggering 83% of Americans want brain chips to be tested using a higher standard than currently exists for medical devices.
A higher standard. That request is a powerful statement, isn't it? Most medical devices go through really rigorous testing already, but the public perceives the brain as needing an entirely new category of caution.
Yes, exactly. And linked to that, 78% of respondents believe the chips would probably or definitely be used before we fully understand their long-term effects on human health. This reflects, I think, a profound distrust in the speed of commercial tech adoption versus the speed of careful, maybe generational medical review. They fear the profit motive will simply outpace safety.
Which seems like a reasonable fear given past experiences with tech rollouts. Okay, so this brings us neatly to the core issue driving this urgent policy debate,
Yep.
the nature of the data itself. When we talk about neurotechnology, it's easy to focus just on the invasive surgical chips, right?
Yeah.
But we have to remember that neurotech encompasses a much wider range of devices, things that directly read, measure, or even manipulate brain data. And this includes non-invasive devices that are already on the market.
Right. We're talking about things like consumer EEG headsets, electroencephalography devices, like Muse or Emotive, which measure electrical activity right on the scalp.
Yeah.
And these are just toys. They're already being used to measure states like sleep quality, attention levels, stress,
Mm-hmm.
maybe in corporate wellness programs or even just at home.
And the data generated by these technologies, even the non-invasive ones, it seems fundamentally different from other kinds of personal data. You hear legal and ethical scholars pretty much unanimously calling mental privacy the final frontier of privacy, defining brain data as like the most intimate and private of all information. I mean, the technology, at least in research settings, has already demonstrated potential to measure emotional responses, identify preferences, likes and dislikes, and even help diagnose complex conditions like depression or ADHD.
That's definitely the expert consensus. Brain data is sort of the gateway to the self. But, and this is fascinating, how the public actually perceives this information compared to other data types. Well, it reveals a potentially dangerous disconnect that policymakers really need to address. In a 2017 U.S. survey, researchers categorized data into three factors: what they call private, like your social security number or emails, then mental affective, brain data, thoughts, emotions, and finally, public, things like media preferences, political views.
Okay, so if the experts are calling it the most intimate data, how did the public actually rank it? Where did it fall?
Well, the ranking comparison shows that while the public correctly viewed mental affective data as more sensitive than, say, public data, they perceived it as significantly less sensitive than that truly private information. For instance, an SSN, which is really just an administrative financial identifier, was rated as very sensitive by 89.2% of respondents, almost everyone. None of the mental affective data points even came close to that high level of perceived urgency.
I find that incredibly counterintuitive, honestly. Why would I worry more about a stolen SSN, which, okay, results in financial risk, than potentially stolen thought patterns, which feels like a mental privacy risk?
It likely comes down to tangibility.
Mm.
People understand immediately what a stolen SSN can do: drain your bank account, ruin your credit. It's concrete. Mental data exploitation.
Hmm.
It feels less tangible right now. It's harder to picture the immediate harm. We need to look closer at the spectrum of data sensitivity within the brain data itself. People seem most concerned about the internal content that feels truly abstract and personal.
Like their literal thoughts, the stuff inside their head.
Exactly. Thoughts in one's mind, 62.6% rated that very sensitive. And mental images, 58.3%, very sensitive. Those were considered highly sensitive. But the generalized states, the kind of data actually being collected by consumer devices right now, those were often ranked lower. Less sensitive items included generalized affective states like concentration, focus, alertness, even drowsiness.
So, if a BCI company is selling a device that promises to track my focus levels throughout the workday, and that data somehow gets compromised, the average person doesn't feel the same level of alarm as they would if, say, their email password was leaked online.
Precisely. In fact, many of these generalized states were often ranked lower in perceived sensitivity than something like relationship history.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the danger, right? Consumers maybe don't fully grasp the informational richness that can be extracted from seemingly benign, generalized brain signals, especially when they're aggregated and run through advanced machine learning algorithms.
And that misunderstanding leads directly to some very real risks and vulnerabilities. When we talk about data leaks and breaches in this context, we aren't just potentially compromising identity in the traditional sense. We could be compromising mental health profiles, cognitive assessments, maybe even future legal standing.
That's the vulnerability exactly. We have the sort of generalized de-anonymization risk where personalized brain data features could perhaps be cross-referenced with other data types. Think about how facial reconstruction can sometimes happen based on MRI data. But we also have specific targeted attacks already demonstrated. Researchers showed off the hemorrhage attack, which used machine learning to predict alcohol usage disorder with, get this, 96% precision from simple EEG data.
96% on a highly sensitive medical condition. That could easily be used against a person by an insurance company, a future employer. Heck, even for disturbingly targeted advertising, that's staggering.
It is. And another specific example is the alter ego system. This is a non-invasive headset that detected silent speech, your internal monologue, with 92% accuracy just for digit recognition. So if a user is silently thinking about their PI number or a password while wearing something like that, that data is now potentially vulnerable to interception. This elevates the risk of BCI security from just a data breach to potentially the ultimate form of digital vulnerability.
We should also probably note that sensitivity perception wasn't uniform across the population in that survey, right? It apparently increased with age, was higher among college-educated individuals, and slightly higher among females. This suggests that maybe as awareness of the technology grows and as younger, more educated generations interact more with these devices, the demand for greater privacy protections will inevitably rise. It seems less about tech adoption status and more about just being informed about the underlying risks.
That sounds right. Awareness seems key.
Okay, so given these rapidly evolving tech capabilities and the, frankly, scary potential for intrusive access to our neural activity, the reaction from policymakers and human rights advocates has been, well, extraordinary. This is the genesis, really, of neurorights. It seems driven largely by researchers like Dr. Raphael Just, who saw the need for new human rights protections tailored specifically to the brain.
Yeah, the foundational argument is essentially that the scope and power of neurotech are just so disruptive that our existing human rights treaties and privacy laws, they just don't quite cut it. They weren't designed for this. And just to be clear, neurotechnology is defined pretty broadly here. Basically anything that reads, measures, or manipulates brain data. This ranges from invasive devices like deep brain stimulation, or DBS, used for conditions like Parkinson's, which involves surgically implanted electrodes, all the way down to those non-invasive EEG consumer devices we mentioned earlier, like the Muse headband.
So if the existing rights aren't seen as sufficient, what exactly are these new protections designed to cover? USTA and the Neurorights Foundation have formalized their advocacy into 5 core neurorights. Maybe you can walk through what these mean in practice for the listener.
Sure. The first one, and perhaps the most intuitive, is the right to mental privacy. This is essentially the right to prevent your neural activity from being recorded, deciphered, or used without your explicit, fully informed consent. This protects against exactly the kind of data extraction we were just discussing.
Okay, that makes sense. Then we get into the more profound, maybe philosophical protections.
Exactly. The second is the right to mental identity. This is about protection against technology fundamentally altering a person's sense of self, their consciousness, or their personality. Think about deep brain stimulation again. If a device is regulating your mood, or maybe enhancing your cognitive drive, the question becomes, are you still you? This right aims to protect the integrity of the self against technological manipulation.
That seems absolutely critical. I mean, if technology can make me more aggressive or more compliant or radically change my preferences, it's not just compromising data, it's compromising my fundamental autonomy.
Which leads directly into the third right, the right to free will. This is designed to prevent neurotechnology from tampering with a person's decision-making abilities. For instance, if a device provides subtle, maybe even unconscious prompts that influence a purchasing decision or a political vote, that potentially violates the autonomy of free will.
Okay. And the last 2 focus more on equity and fairness.
That's right, which are essential in pretty much any new technological domain.
Yeah.
The fourth right is fair access to mental augmentation. This tries to prevent a scenario where only the ultra-rich can afford cognitive enhancement technologies, leading to, vast societal gaps between the enhanced and the unenhanced.
A kind of neurological divide.
Precisely. And the fifth is protection from bias embedded in neurotechnology algorithms. If the training data used to develop a BCI is skewed heavily toward one demographic, the resulting algorithm could easily misdiagnose or poorly treat someone from another group, essentially reinforcing existing societal biases, but now at a neurological level.
And this whole movement, it's anything but theoretical, right? It has already yielded a pretty major global precedent, the Chilean case study. In October 2021, Chile actually became the first country in the world to include neuro rights in its constitution. That's huge, an amendment to their highest law.
It really was a landmark moment for global governance. Chile amended Article 19 of its constitution to explicitly mandate that the law must regulate the use of scientific and technological development on persons, with special safeguards placed specifically on cerebral activity and the information deriving from it. So this clearly elevates brain data above general data privacy concerns, giving it constitutional weight.
And the regulatory law that followed, it detailed specific, actionable restrictions. These seem to illustrate the profound fears driving this legislation. For example, any proposed neurotechnology has to be registered with an independent medical authority, kind of like the FDA in the US. And this authority gets the power to restrict use under a very specific set of conditions.
Yeah, the restrictions are highly targeted. The authority can restrict use if the technology's objective is clearly to influence human conduct without consent, or if it exploits the weaknesses of specific vulnerable groups. That's a nod to protection against targeted manipulation. They can also restrict tech that extracts data without explicit consent. And crucially, they can restrict use if it's shown to adversely affect neuroplasticity, especially in children and young adults, recognizing the developmental vulnerability of the young brain.
What's really fascinating here is that this isn't just theory sitting on paper, it's actually being tested in court already. We have real-world legal action stemming from this new framework.
Absolutely. In August 2023, the Chilean Supreme Court ruled against the BCI company Emotive. The court explicitly cited a constitutional neurorights provision when it ordered the company to erase the brain data collected from a former senator. This is concrete evidence that the constitutional safeguard has real teeth, and it immediately creates a powerful legal precedent for other countries that might be considering similar legislation.
So Chile is really out front on this one. Okay, so while the Chilean case marks a major victory for proponents of neurorights, this whole movement faces significant pushback. It's not universally accepted. The critics raise a really crucial practical question that kind of shifts the debate away from the tech itself and more into jurisprudence. Are new rights actually needed?
That is the essential legal criticism, yes. Many legal experts argue quite strongly that this move is, well, unnecessary and potentially even harmful. They contend that our existing rights, things like privacy, cognitive liberty, which is the right to control your own mental processes, and robust data protection laws inspired by global standards like the GDPR, they argue these are already sufficient to cover these risks. The argument is essentially that existing laws just need to be enforced and interpreted more broadly to explicitly cover neural data. We don't need a whole new category.
So the critique is, if I understand it, that by calling for new rights, you might inadvertently signal to the courts, maybe to corporations, that the rights we currently have don't cover these emerging technologies, which could create a sort of dangerous regulatory gap until new legislation is fully worked out and ratified.
That's definitely a risk. It's what some critics call rights inflationism. They argue that adding new, hyper-specific rights unnecessarily devalues the established human rights that are meant to protect the person as a whole. They worry about diluting core protections, making them seem less powerful.
A major part of this counter-critique seems rooted in what the technology can actually do today versus what we fear it might do tomorrow. The debate seems driven by three sort of contested concepts that critics argue maybe exaggerate the threat.
Right. The first concept is neuroessentialism. This is the tendency to reduce the entire person, the self, exclusively down to neural processes. Critics often label this a mereological fallacy.
Okay, let's slow down there for a second. That phrase, mereological fallacy, sounds pretty academic. Can you unpack that for the listener? What does that actually mean?
Certainly. The mereological fallacy, put simply, is the logical error of attributing psychological characteristics that really belong to the whole person, the entire thinking being, to just one of its parts, specifically the brain. Critics argue that when you start legislating based on neuroessentialism, you're making a kind of philosophical mistake. You're treating the brain as if it were the entire human identity, rather than just the organ of the mind. For instance, my brain doesn't choose a course of action. I choose a course of action using my brain. It's a subtle but crucial distinction. If legislation treats the brain as the whole person, it might miss the full context of human behavior, experience, and intention.
Okay, that makes sense. So don't reduce the complexity of consciousness down to just firing synapses when making laws. Got it. The second concept that critics say fuels the urgency is neuroexceptionalism.
Yes. This is the claim that brain data is somehow inherently exceptional, unique, requiring its own special legal treatment, unlike any other data. The critique here is pretty fierce. Legal scholars argue that a lot of our existing data, think about your comprehensive browsing history, your minute-by-minute location data from GPS, your financial records, your passwords. They argue this stuff is currently far more revealing about your intentions, your fears, your health status than, say, raw, aggregated EEG data is today.
So critics are demanding what they call epistemological humility. If I'm understanding this right, they're basically saying we shouldn't pass laws based on some, Black Mirror episode scenario that might happen in 50 years.
Right.
But instead, we should focus on the real current data threats we see today, which they argue are already covered or should be covered by existing privacy laws if we just enforce them properly.
Precisely. They caution strongly against neurohype magnifying, the speculative, often science-fictional, eventual consequences of neurotechnology to rush legislation now. While, anticipatory ethics is valuable, rushing laws based on speculation rather than on current scientific reality creates a very real danger of unintended consequences that could impede genuine medical progress.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the practical danger of this kind of potentially overprotective legislation isn't just hypothetical, is it? Chile's own previous experience with some overly restrictive laws serves as a stark and frankly sobering warning here.
It's a profound precedent, yes. Back in 2012, Chile passed a law, Law 2584, which was intended to protect vulnerable groups. Noble goal. This law essentially banned scientific studies on psychologically or intellectually disabled patients who were unable to express their wishes or provide explicit informed consent. The intent was entirely altruistic, to protect them from exploitation.
Okay, sounds reasonable on the surface. But what was the practical consequence?
The consequence was, frankly, catastrophic for medical research in those areas in Chile. It led to a dramatic drop in clinical trials for essential conditions that affect these very same patients, things like Alzheimer's, severe depression, schizophrenia. These individuals were effectively excluded from potentially life-saving or life-improving research benefits simply because the law focused so heavily on preventing potential exploitation that it inadvertently blocked access to care and research.
Wow. Okay, now apply that same kind of cautious, perhaps overprotective approach to BCIs. The paradigmatic condition for BCI clinical application is often the completely locked-in state, right? Patients with conditions like advanced ALS who are conscious but have absolutely zero muscular control.
Exactly. They are by definition unable to physically or verbally consent in the traditional way. So if overly restrictive neurorights legislation regarding consent gets put in place, legislation that demands explicit conscious consent for any interaction with cerebral activity, it could inadvertently rule out the clinical application of BCIs and neuromonitoring for the very patients who need the technology most desperately. The law meant to safeguard the most vulnerable could end up blocking their only potential channel for communication, their path to improved quality of life, maybe even life-saving treatment. This tension between anticipation and caution, that's the central policy dilemma here.
A real balancing act. Okay, stepping back now from the immediate legal challenges of data privacy and consent, let's look at the ultimate, maybe long-term goal for some neurotechnology researchers and AI enthusiasts, a goal that really touches on the fundamental meaning of life and death: digital immortality.
Right, digital immortality. It's generally defined as the persistence of human consciousness beyond biological death. This would be achieved, theoretically, by salvaging thoughts, memories, personality, maybe even consciousness itself, into digital mediums. Now, this concept exists on a spectrum. On one end, you have relatively basic AI-based avatars simulated from a person's digital footprint. Their emails, social media history, maybe voice recordings. We're already seeing early versions of this.
Like those grief tech chatbots.
Exactly. Then on the other, far more ambitious end, you have the sci-fi goal of full mind uploading.
Full mind uploading. Just to clarify for everyone, that means transferring and somehow rebuilding the entire neural structure, maybe synapse by synapse, into a virtual computational environment. While that's still likely decades or maybe even centuries away technologically, the ethical and philosophical questions it raises are immediate, aren't they? The most fundamental one being the identity crisis.
Absolutely. Can a digital simulation truly be that person? That question hits right at the core of selfhood. If the original biological person dies, and an advanced AI simulation that perfectly recreates their memories, their voice, their personality quirks is running on a server somewhere, is that continuity of self maintained? Is it them?
And what happens if that reconstructed consciousness begins to evolve? If it learns new things, develops opinions that are radically different from the original biological person? Where did the continuity break, if it ever existed? Is it a perfect copy, frozen in time? Or is it more like a digital ghost, a new being based on the data of the old one that then goes on its own path?
The problem of personal identity, it's like the ship of Theseus paradox applied directly to the mind. It becomes almost insurmountable, doesn't it? The original person valued certain things. The uploaded consciousness, maybe freed from biological limits and needs, might value entirely different things. If this digital persona, this entity, commits crimes or writes masterpieces, to whom does that moral and legal responsibility belong? The estate of the deceased person, or this newly created digital entity itself?
Yeah, mind-bending stuff. And then we shift from those deep philosophical questions about identity to the terrifyingly practical questions around control, exploitation, and frankly, the potential dark side of this kind of digital permanence.
Take consent, which, as we've seen, is already problematic even when dealing with living people. Who decides on the upload for an incapacitated person? And the ultimate privacy risk lies in who controls the digital persistence of the self after biological death. Does the deceased person have any say in how their digital avatar is used post-mortem? Could a company, for example, license the persona of a famous writer to perpetually generate new, maybe unauthorized content in their style?
And just imagine the privacy and security risk. If your entire consciousness, your deepest fears, your most private memories, everything that makes you you, is now just code on a server, that represents the ultimate, most catastrophic form of identity theft imaginable.
Absolutely. Hackers could potentially manipulate or misuse an uploaded consciousness, maybe subtly altering memories, or even creating digital clones designed for specific exploitation or disinformation. Furthermore, the corporation owning the underlying technology that enables digital immortality, they could effectively control the digital persona indefinitely. They could essentially commodify the self. You are no longer a person. You become a licensed product, subject to terms of service.
Chilling. And because this would inevitably, at least initially, be a tremendously expensive technology, the societal division it could create would be unparalleled.
For sure. The access would likely be limited by massive socioeconomic disparity, at least for a very long time. This raises the critical issue of a new digital immortal elite, a class of people who can afford to transcend biological death and its limitations, leaving the rest of society fundamentally behind. This isn't just inequality in wealth anymore. It's inequality in existence itself. It potentially creates a permanent, two-tiered humanity. The pursuit of immortality, ironically, might fundamentally diminish the value we place on a finite mortal life for those who cannot afford the upgrade.
A future nobody really asked for, perhaps. Hashtag tag outro.
So, to try and summarize today's deep dives, we are clearly operating in a domain where the sheer speed of technological development is fundamentally outpacing our ability to effectively govern it. We're balancing this extraordinary therapeutic potential, giving voice and movement back to the paralyzed, treating neurological disorders with these really profound ethical challenges to personal identity, privacy, and the very sanctity of our own thoughts. The debate ultimately is less about the technical capabilities of a specific microchip and far more about what it fundamentally means to be human, to have private thoughts, and to control your own destiny in the face of powerful new tools.
Yeah, and the policy challenge for regulators globally seems to be one of intense tension. There's the perceived urgency of acting quickly on future fears, what we've called neurohype, versus the need for careful, maybe epistemologically humble crafting of legislation. Legislation that avoids those unintended consequences, like blocking medical progress for the very people who desperately need these tools. We really have to learn from examples like Chile's past regulatory mistakes, maybe, to ensure we don't accidentally criminalize compassion in our zeal to protect privacy and autonomy.
It's a fine line. We know the public today is highly concerned, and rightly so, about the security of their social security number or their email inbox, because those are tangible threats with immediate consequences. But if neurotechnology matures to the point where it can decode your most intimate anxieties, your political leanings, your subconscious biases, maybe with that 96% precision we talked about. What happens when that mental affective data, that detailed profile of your cognitive and emotional self, becomes the new Social Security number? An essential, yet supremely vulnerable, key to your life that could govern everything from your insurance rates to your job prospects, maybe even your social credit score. That's the really big question we leave you with today.
Until next time, keep thinking freely.